I'm here today with Lisa Deam. Lisa is an author and speaker who uses art of the Christian past to illuminate modern faith. A former professor, she has a PhD in medieval art history from the University of Chicago and was a Fulbright Fellow to Belgium. Lisa believes that medieval art has something to say to Christians in the 21st century and loves leading spiritual formation workshops on the Christian Middle Ages. Her writing won a Best of the Christian Press award from the Associated Church Press. So Lisa, it's really great to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
So Lisa, maybe you can just give folks a little bit more depth of your background beyond what I was just trying to highlight.
Sure. Thanks. Well, as you mentioned, I have a PhD in art history from the University of Chicago. And my plan was to go into academia and teach art history. And after I graduated with the doctorate, I had a wonderful postdoc fellowship. And that involved a fair amount of teaching. And that postdoc really turned into a time of discernment for me because I realized that academic teaching was not my vocation after all. And that was kind of difficult because I was on the path that, we're all supposed to be on when we enter a doctorate program, and, what I trained for 8 to 10 years. So it was difficult, and I did not find a new path right away. But what became clear after I left that path was that the art and the history of what I had studied as an academic stayed with me, and that even though academia might not be my vocation, this time period, the imagery, the rich spirituality, that certainly was, because I could not get that out of my head. And it really actually was helping my faith too. And I'm going to tell you why. I started slowly writing about those topics that I had studied, art, spirituality, from a more personal and faith-based perspective rather than an academic perspective. So it was like combining the two parts of myself, the more academic side and then the faith side, the personal side. And so that was very rewarding. And that's the path I've been on and what I'm trying to do today, which is to write about the Christian faith and really spiritual formation through the lens of history. And to show that these historical figures, can be our companions and our mentors on the path that we're on.
Very cool. Well, it's an area that I don't think enough people probably pay attention to, and certainly in our modern world today, a lot of folks are just completely unfamiliar with a lot of that history. So I think it's really nice to illuminate it. So Lisa's got a new book coming out. The release date is February 2nd, and the name of the book is 3,000 Miles to Jesus, Pilgrimage as a Way of Life for Spiritual Seekers. So I want to get to that book in a moment and dive into it in more detail. But first, I'd like to talk about another book that Lisa previously wrote called A World Transformed, Exploring the Spirituality of Medieval Maps. And as a person myself who loves maps, I thought, that sounds very interesting. So maybe, Lisa, you can just tell us first about that book.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. And that's a book that did grow out of my origins as an academic, because in the dissertation that I wrote, a world map from the 15th century did play a role in it. It was really a key image that I studied. And the map was one of those images that then stayed with me after I left academia and kind of just kept pulling on me and didn't want to let me go. And that's because I started looking at it in a slightly different way. There was a class of maps really throughout the medieval period that showed the world as a circle, showing all the inhabited parts of the world, and the city of Jerusalem was right at the center. And on many of the maps, like the Hereford Mappamundi, that map shows an image of the crucifixion of Christ rising from the city of Jerusalem. And that became for me, a real image that defined my faith as it's a Christ-centered world. We talk about worldviews in a Christian worldview, and here is a world that is literally a Christ-centered worldview. And I thought that was so important and such a rich image for our faith and how we could see our world that I began writing about it. Trying to do it rigorously and historically accurate, but also showing how it can guide Christians as we walk in our world today.
Very cool. Well, I think it's very fascinating. As I said, I need to pick up a copy of that and read it at some point, or actually just enjoy, the visuals.
Fascinating and weird and wonderful maps. Really.
So, as I mentioned, Lisa's got a new book coming out called 3,000 Miles to Jesus, Pilgrimage as a Way of Life for Spiritual Seekers. And I was glad to see that John Sweeney actually wrote the foreword for that. So maybe before, kind of we dive into the content of the book, you can just talk a little bit about how that book came to be.
Okay. So that book is almost like, in a way, like part two of my first book, A World Transformed. How it came about is that in my book, A World Transformed, the one about medieval world maps, that book did have several chapters on the topic of pilgrimage, because you can't talk about really the medieval world or medieval faith and spirituality without getting into the topic of pilgrimage. And one of the maps that book focuses on, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, actually shows several pilgrimage routes. And one of them being the city of Jerusalem, the premier pilgrimage destination in the Middle Ages, right in the center of the world, but it showed other pilgrimage routes too. So I got a little bit into pilgrimage. And then, as I was finishing the book, I realized that in itself, pilgrimage was such another rich image for our faith today that I kind of took one or two of the chapters in A World Transformed and just blew that up into a whole new book that's focused exclusively on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So that's kind of how that book came about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So for those of us that are neophytes at this, can you explain a little bit about what exactly is pilgrimage and what are the different types of pilgrimage?
Yeah. Well, a pilgrimage is a sacred journey, or a journey to a sacred or holy place. And today, the term and concept is used pretty broadly, so that a pilgrimage could be any kind of journey of deep meaning or that perhaps brings personal transformation. Now, in my work, and I like that meaning, I think that's great, because I think we've all used the term pilgrimage or journey to describe parts of our faith. In my book, I'm kind of going back to a traditional definition of pilgrimage, which is a journey to a sacred place like a shrine or a church, often a very long, involved and difficult journey that medieval people would take as a way to practice their faith. So I like all these definitions of pilgrimage that we work with, but I wanted to explore what the great age of pilgrimage could show us about this concept that we like so much today.
Cool. That's. I mean, I think it's one of those things that another lost kind of concept at some level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the Middle Ages, right? It was much more meaningful, right? Pilgrimage was very meaningful then. So why? But why did you choose, that era to highlight?
Well, the Middle Ages, partly because it's what I knew the best, but also that was the great age of pilgrimage, really. And it's kind of where many of our notions of Christian pilgrimage really, I don't know if I'd say that they were born, but really flourished. So when people today walk the Camino de Santiago in France and Spain, that was the most important pilgrimage route in Europe in the Middle Ages outside of Rome. So that harks back to a medieval tradition. And like I said, to study the history of our faith from a medieval perspective, you just can't do it without pilgrimage. It really defined how they thought about their life of faith in such an important way. And one thing it reminded me of as I delved into the topic is our biblical role as pilgrims. And that's one main reason I wanted to tackle it, not just because, oh, here is a fascinating devotional practice from the Middle Ages, but also it gets at what our biblical role is too. Because the book of Hebrews, for example, chapter 11, talks about how we follow in the footsteps of spiritual forebears, like Abraham, for example, and that we're foreigners and strangers in the world like them, and that we're on our way to a better country. So that's one place where the Bible assigns us a role as pilgrims. And so I thought it was important, an important study to help us understand our own faith, as well as the history of our faith.
So who are some of the famous pilgrims that you cover in your book?
Okay. A lot of them are not so famous. A lot of them are everyone's favorite source from the Middle Ages, anonymous. A lot of them are anonymous that went and came back. And we know about pilgrims' journeys because some pilgrims did keep records or come back and write a travel guide. So one rather well-known pilgrim of the later Middle Ages is Marjorie Kemp, the late 14th, early 15th century mystic and laywoman. And she went to Jerusalem in the early 15th century, and she's a pretty well-known figure for people who like contemplative history, people who are interested in the mystics. So that's a prominent one, and she figures in my book. Now, the other two main pilgrims in my book are probably less well-known, who just most of us generally, and I did not know them before I started either. Pietro Cassola, an Italian canon, and Friar Felix Fabry, a Swiss Dominican. And even though they're not well known, they are just fascinating, funny, endearing. Their stories make wonderful accompaniments to our own journey. And I'll just mention one more that does feature in the book, and that is Ignatius of Loyola. Even though he's later than the medieval period, he went to Jerusalem, arriving in about, I think, 1523. And after a very long journey, very long pause. And I wanted to feature him because his journey has a lot to teach us too.
Very cool. It reminds me of Frederick Buechner's book, Godric. As part of that book, there's a pilgrimage, involved to Jerusalem.
I've heard so much about that book recently that I'm going to have to put it on my list now.
It's a novel, but it was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. And it's an amazing piece of work because the entire book is written in, I think it's 12th century English.
Wow.
So it's just an amazing piece of work.
I can't believe I haven't read that one yet.
Yeah, I recommend it. Highly recommend it. So what's your favorite story out of all these pilgrims trips?
Mm-hmm. I think my favorite one is the Swiss Dominican friar that I mentioned, Felix Fabry. I like to call him Friar Felix. And he went to Jerusalem twice in the 15th century. So he was obviously a great and courageous traveler, not afraid to travel. And this was one of his greatest desires, was to go to Jerusalem. But as I relate in the book, even so, on I think it was his first voyage, as soon as he got a few miles from his hometown and he had taken leave of his spiritual father and all his friends, he writes that he was assailed by such a great homesickness. And this is just a tiny little distance from his home. He was so homesick that he wanted to turn back right away and said that this was a mistake, and all the people that encouraged me I consider to be enemies of my life because I'm not going to make it and I'm terrified of the sea. And just this sort of heartfelt confession he said, if I weren't so ashamed, I would just turn back right now. Well, we know, he did press on and reach Jerusalem. But what I love is that story, I just think it meets us where we are. And I tried to write about the stories of pilgrims that are like that show that, they were people, and we get homesick too. And not just on our physical journeys, but just spiritually. Like, we don't necessarily want to take the next step. We're afraid. We want to turn back. We don't think we're going to make it. And I feel like that, like I said, that the quirks that they have, they just they're human and they meet us where we are, and that's what makes them such good companions. So I think that's my favorite one, the pilgrim that got homesick 30 miles out of town.
That's really cool. Well, what other kind of concepts do you feel are transferable to today's world?
Oh, well, so many. Ignatius of Loyola, who I mentioned, he started off for Jerusalem shortly after he really had a heart conversion to Christianity. And he took a small detour to the town of Manresa in Spain and ended up staying there something like 11 months. And that's where he hatched some of the ideas for the spiritual exercises and where God really worked in his heart and in his life.
Wow.
And we don't know exactly why the detour lasted so long. We're not sure. But he eventually made it to Jerusalem. But he went with so much more knowledge. What I say in the book is he went as a contemplative rather than as a convert, because God used the time, all that time of like waiting for whatever it was he was waiting for, to form him and to help him grow in his faith. And I use that as, I just think that's a great example of how pilgrimage takes time. And we are in such a hurry today in our society. We always want the quick fix. And I think that we want it in our spiritual life too. I mean, I know I do. We're growing very impatient about God not working fast enough or things like that. But the idea of having patience with the process, and that it's going to take as long as it takes, and that the process will form us. So meeting God where he has us for today while we wait to go forward. I think that's another important lesson. It just takes time.
So without divulging any secrets, can you say anything about any future projects that you might be working on?
I'm actually not sure. One thing I tried to do in my book, 3,000 Miles to Sis, is to approach the journeys I wanted to write about in a creative and immersive way. So I didn't want to just present lessons of pilgrimage or topics in pilgrimage. I wanted to take the reader on a journey with the pilgrims, and so that the reader has more of an experience. And so the book is supposed to be like a vicarious travel experience to Jerusalem. So that aspect of being immersive in history a little bit and approaching it in a creative, experiential way makes me want to cast my eye on writing historical fiction.
Cool. That's great.
I don't know. That is a whole genre. But
I think that sounds like a great idea.
Well, it sounds fun. I love approaching the past in that kind of creative, experiential way. So I'll have to see what I want to do with that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Lisa, it's really great to speak with you about your books, and thank you for joining us, and good luck with the book launch. I hope it goes incredibly well.
Thanks. I appreciate it so much.